The Galactic Assembly had gathered in its grand chamber, a sprawling construct of shimmering crystal and pulsating light suspended in the void of space. Representatives of thousands of species sat in their respective seats, their forms as varied as the stars themselves. Some had chitinous exoskeletons, others undulating tendrils, while a few radiated an almost celestial glow. Despite their diversity, they all shared a common sentiment that day: disdain for humanity. Earth was a recent discovery on the galactic stage, its people having only just begun to send their fragile probes beyond their own star system. To the Assembly, humanity was insignificant, a backwater species barely capable of scratching the surface of spacefaring technology, bound to a planet that was more notable for its resources than its inhabitants. What little they knew of us, they did not respect. We were violent, disorganized, and primitive. In their eyes, we were unworthy of a seat among the stars. The debate over Earth's fate was brief. Some Assembly members argued for total eradication, claiming that humanity's aggressive tendencies made us a potential threat in the distant future. But cooler heads prevailed. After all, why destroy a resource when it could be exploited? Enslavement was a more profitable option. Our planet was rich in minerals. Our bodies were robust and adaptable, and our labor could fuel the Assembly's endless appetite for expansion. The vote was called, and one by one the representatives cast their decision. 100 species, then 1,000, then 10,000, all in favor. The official decree echoed through the chamber like a death knell. Humanity was to be enslaved, its people dispersed across the galaxy as workers and servants. No objections, no dissent. For the first time in centuries, the Assembly had achieved complete unanimity. The fleet arrived 6 months later. The skies over Earth darkened as alien ships descended, blotting out the sun. They came in silence, their presence alone a declaration of dominance. Colossal vessels hovered over every major city, their forms sleek and otherworldly, glowing with energies we couldn't comprehend. The panic was immediate. Governments scrambled to respond, deploying fighter jets and missiles in a desperate, hopeless attempt to repel the invaders. It was like throwing stones at a mountain. The Assembly's representatives emerged from their ships, towering figures cloaked in shimmering garments, their alien forms imposing and strange. They addressed the leaders of Earth not as equals, but as cattle. Their voices were cold and devoid of empathy as they explained the new order. Humanity would be integrated into the galactic system, they said, but not as allies or partners. We were to be laborers, stripped of our freedom and dignity, our lives dedicated to serving the Assembly's needs. Resistance, they told us, was futile. They demonstrated this with terrifying efficiency. In minutes, entire squadrons of military aircraft were vaporized. Skyscrapers crumbled under the weight of their weapons, reduced to rubble with a single strike. Cities that dared to resist were made examples of, their populations subdued with overwhelming force. I remember standing in the streets of my city, watching as one of their massive ships hovered overhead. The air itself seemed to hum with its presence, a constant reminder of our helplessness. People screamed, ran, and cried, their terror mirrored in my own heart. We were outmatched in every way, technologically, militarily, even intellectually. The Assembly saw us as nothing more than an inconvenience, a problem to be solved. And yet, even in the face of such absolute power, something stubborn lingered in the human spirit. As they rounded us up, placing us in camps and stripping us of our autonomy, I felt a quiet, simmering rage. They didn't see it. They couldn't. To them, we were too small, too weak, too insignificant to matter. But deep down, I knew something they didn't. Humanity has always been at its strongest when the odds were impossible. The camps were a nightmare, a cold and calculated system designed to break us. Rows of crude barracks stretched as far as the eye could see, surrounded by towering fences made of alien alloys that shimmered with an unnatural energy. The air smelled of metal and despair. Armed overseers patrolled the perimeters. Hulking figures encased in armor, wielding weapons that could incinerate a person with a single shot. They didn't speak our language, and they didn't need to. Their message was clear: obey or suffer. They divided us into groups, separating families, friends, anyone who might give each other strength. Our names were taken from us, replaced with numbers etched into metal tags we were forced to wear around our necks. They stripped away everything they could: our possessions, our dignity, our freedom. But they didn't understand humanity. They didn't understand that there are some things you can't strip away. They couldn't take our memories, our hope, or our will to fight. At first, we were too broken to think of resistance. They worked us to exhaustion, assigning us to back-breaking labor in mines, factories, and shipyards. Every day was a cycle of toil, hunger, and pain. People died by the dozens, their bodies unceremoniously discarded. To the overseers, we were disposable, replaceable, less than nothing. But for every human that fell, 100 more learned to endure. It began with whispers. In the dead of night, when the overseers were at their most complacent, we shared stories. Tales of defiance, of small acts of rebellion that kept the fire alive. Someone in a distant camp had sabotaged a shipment of alien machinery. Another had managed to steal a guard's weapon before being executed. These stories spread like sparks, igniting something within us that no amount of cruelty could extinguish. The first real act of rebellion happened in one of the mining colonies. A group of humans, miners who had once worked with nothing but pickaxes and shovels, turned their tools into weapons. They didn't have much, just sharp pieces of metal and a handful of explosives they'd cobbled together from stolen materials. It was a suicide mission, but they didn't care. They were desperate to prove one thing: that humanity would not go quietly. The revolt was brief but devastating. They ambushed a group of overseers, killing them with brutal efficiency before seizing control of a cargo ship. They knew they wouldn't make it out alive, but they didn't run. Instead, they sent a message. Using the ship's communication systems, they broadcast a single phrase to every other human labor camp in the galaxy: "We are not broken." The assembly crushed the revolt, of course. They sent in reinforcements, overwhelming the miners with their superior firepower. But it didn't matter. The damage had been done. That message rippled through the camps like a shock wave, rekindling a sense of purpose in people who had nearly given up. If those miners could fight back, so could we. From that moment on, the camps were never the same. We began to organize in secret, forming networks that stretched across entire star systems. We communicated in code, passing along information, supplies, and stolen weapons. Every act of defiance, no matter how small, became a symbol of our resilience. We sabotaged machinery, disrupted production schedules, and quietly undermined the overseers' authority. The overseers responded with harsher punishments, but their brutality only fueled our determination. For every human they executed, 10 more rose to take their place. We weren't just surviving anymore, we were preparing for something the Assembly never thought possible. They believed they had crushed us, that we were too weak and scattered to fight back. They didn't realize that they had given us exactly what we needed: a common enemy and the time to learn their weaknesses. We weren't just prisoners anymore, we were soldiers in the making. Humanity had always been defined by its adaptability. From the moment we first picked up tools to the day we looked to the stars, we'd learned to survive in environments that should have killed us. The camps were no different. At first, they broke us, grinding us down into something raw and vulnerable. But the cracks they created only allowed something stronger to grow beneath. Humanity had an unparalleled ability to learn, to adapt, and to evolve under pressure. The overseers didn't see it happening, but they were building their own downfall, one day at a time. We began to study them. Every alien species that made up the Assembly's overseers had their own unique quirks, their own biology, and their own blind spots. Some needed specialized atmospheres to survive. Others relied heavily on exosuits to protect their fragile forms. Many couldn't function for long in Earth-like environments, which made them reliant on technology to bridge the gap. We observed their movements, their routines, and their tools, committing every detail to memory. They thought of us as little more than animals, incapable of comprehending their superior systems. That arrogance was their first mistake. Even their technology, so advanced it seemed like magic at first, had its limits. It didn't take long for the brightest among us to start figuring out how their devices worked. Engineers who once built aircraft and satellites began disassembling stolen alien equipment in secret, learning its inner workings piece by piece. Scientists who had been stripped of their laboratories now conducted experiments in the shadows of the camps. Hackers, once confined to basements back on Earth, found ways to access the assembly's networks, skimming bits of data and finding vulnerabilities. But it wasn't just the intellectuals who adapted. Everyone contributed in their own way. The physically strong among us trained in secret, honing their bodies for the fights we knew were coming. Those with a talent for organization formed underground resistance cells, coordinating efforts across multiple camps. Artists, writers, and musicians kept hope alive, reminding us of what we were fighting for. Even the elderly, the sick, and the weak found ways to help, acting as lookouts, messengers, and sources of wisdom. The overseers didn't notice the shift at first. To them, we were as docile as ever, dutifully following their orders and submitting to their authority. But beneath the surface, we were changing. The camps became our classrooms, and their oppression became our training ground. Every punishment they inflicted, every injustice we endured, only made us more determined. We turned their attempts to break us into lessons, learning from our failures and adapting to their methods. It wasn't long before we started to test our newfound knowledge. Small acts of rebellion became more frequent, and they were no longer random. A piece of machinery would malfunction at a critical moment, delaying production by hours. A shipment of vital supplies would disappear, only to turn up days later in useless fragments. An overseer's weapon would mysteriously fail during a routine inspection. These weren't accidents. They were calculated strikes, each one a message. We were still here, and we were getting smarter. The overseers tried to tighten their grip, but it was too late. For every measure they took, we found a way to counter it. Their attempts to isolate us only strengthened our underground networks. Their punishments only deepened our resolve. Their arrogance blinded them to the truth. They were no longer in control, we were. As we grew stronger, so did our vision of the future. We weren't just fighting to survive anymore. We were fighting to take back what was ours, and to ensure no one else would ever suffer as we had. The camps were their tool of oppression, but we had turned them into something else entirely, the birthplace of a revolution. The revolt was inevitable. For years, the Assembly had seen the camps as their unshakable foundation of control. A system so vast and ruthlessly efficient that resistance seemed laughable. But while they celebrated their superiority, humanity had been sharpening its teeth in the shadows. By the time the first coordinated uprising began, we were no longer the broken, terrified species they thought they had subdued. We were something far more dangerous. It started with the mining colonies. They had always been the most brutal of the camps, forcing humans to work in near-death conditions, extracting rare minerals essential to the Assembly's technological dominance. The overseers, confident in their control, failed to notice that their human laborers had been hoarding tools and explosives for months. When the revolt began, it was a storm, silent at first, then explosive. In one colony, a group of miners detonated a series of charges that collapsed the tunnels where the overseers' barracks were located. The timing was perfect. They struck during a shift change when the guards were at their most vulnerable. While the explosions echoed through the mines, other groups of miners stormed the surface, wielding sharpened tools and makeshift weapons. Alien overseers, accustomed to the docile compliance of their human charges, fell quickly to the coordinated fury of their captives. The initial victory was more symbolic than strategic. One colony, one victory. But its impact rippled far beyond its isolated location. The surviving miners seized control of a transport ship, one of the smaller cargo vessels used to ferry goods off-world. It wasn't built for combat, but that didn't matter. They commandeered it, broadcasting a message across every known human labor camp. The time is now. The call was answered in places the assembly never expected. In a factory on an industrial moon, human workers shut down production lines and used the tools at their disposal to build crude but effective weapons. They overwhelmed the guards, taking control of the facility and repurposing it as a makeshift fortress. In an agricultural colony, humans poisoned the food supplies destined for the assembly's fleets, crippling their logistics and forcing them to divert resources to find uncontaminated provisions. Every act of rebellion was different, tailored to the resources and vulnerabilities of each camp, but they were all part of the same growing storm. I was in a shipyard when it began. The overseers there were among the most arrogant, secure in their belief that we could never challenge them. But they had underestimated the ingenuity of engineers and technicians who had spent their lives solving problems with limited resources. We had spent months studying the systems that controlled the shipyard's defenses, learning how to exploit their blind spots. When the signal came, we acted without hesitation. The first strike was to disable the automated sentries that lined the perimeter. A team of us, armed with stolen plasma cutters and repurposed welding equipment, breached the Overseer's central command hub and took out their control systems. Chaos erupted as we turned the Overseer's own ships against them. Massive docking cranes, once used to assemble their fleets, became weapons in our hands. The Overseers tried to fight back, but they weren't prepared for the ferocity of an enemy that had nothing left to lose. The assembly responded quickly, deploying fleets to crush the uprisings, but their efforts were scattered and ineffective. For every camp they managed to subdue, 3 more rose in rebellion. And it wasn't just about brute force. Humanity's adaptability and resourcefulness were now on full display. We used guerrilla tactics, sabotage, and the assembly's own arrogance against them. We fought in the mines, the factories, the shipyards, and the fields. We turned their tools into our weapons, their technology into our shields. The revolts weren't just acts of desperation. They were victories in a war the assembly didn't realize they were losing. Every overseer killed, every ship hijacked, and every camp liberated became a symbol of our growing strength. We weren't just fighting to escape, we were fighting to take back what they had stolen from us. And for the first time in years, the galaxy saw something they had never expected: humans who refused to bow. The galaxy finally began to understand what it had unleashed. For years, they had looked down on humanity, seeing us as nothing more than tools, a species too primitive and fractured to be of any consequence. But now, those same species were watching their fleets burn, their strongholds fall, and their once unchallenged dominion begin to crumble. Humanity had risen from the ashes of their oppression, and we were no longer fighting to survive, we were fighting to win. By the time the revolts had coalesced into an organized resistance, humanity had already begun adapting alien technology to suit our needs. The stolen cargo ships and industrial vessels we had commandeered in the early days of rebellion were clumsy and barely armed, but they became the foundation of something greater. In hidden workshops scattered across liberated camps, human engineers worked tirelessly, reverse engineering alien systems and combining them with the ingenuity that had always been our greatest strength. Alien plasma weapons were retrofitted onto human ships. Advanced shielding systems, once incomprehensible to us, were stripped from captured overseer vessels and adapted to our own crude designs. We learned fast, far faster than the assembly had ever anticipated. Every captured ship, every intercepted data log, and every alien weapon we dismantled added to our growing arsenal. What started as a ragtag collection of uprisings quickly transformed into a coordinated war effort. The assembly still had the advantage of numbers and resources, but they were slow, bloated by centuries of complacency. Their ships were built for control, not combat. Their armies had spent centuries crushing resistance with sheer intimidation, not strategy. Against a determined and adaptive enemy, their size became a weakness. I was stationed aboard one of the first fully human refitted warships, a vessel that had once been a transport hauler but now bristled with alien weaponry and human ingenuity. I remember the first time we took it into battle. The assembly had sent a fleet of patrol ships to retake a liberated mining colony, confident that their superior firepower would crush us. What they didn't anticipate was that we knew their tactics, their formations, even the vulnerabilities in their ship designs. We'd studied them for years, and now we used that knowledge against them. When the battle began, it wasn't a fair fight. It was a massacre, but not for us. Our ships moved faster, hit harder, and struck with precision. Their patrol ships, so heavily reliant on centralized command structures, faltered the moment we disrupted their communications. Our fighters swarmed them, exploiting every gap in their defenses, while our larger ships turned their own weapons against them. By the end of the battle, the assembly fleet was in ruins, and their survivors fled in terror. That victory was a turning point. Word spread across the galaxy like wildfire. The humans were no longer just resisting, they were winning. Every species that had supported our enslavement, every government that had cast their vote in favor of exploiting us, now found themselves questioning their own safety. The assembly's leadership scrambled to contain the rebellion, but they were too late. Their enemies were no longer confined to labor camps and mining colonies. We were everywhere now, and we were relentless. What made us truly dangerous, though, wasn't just our newfound technology or our tactical ingenuity. It was the fire that burned within every human who had survived their oppression. We weren't fighting for conquest or revenge, though there was plenty of that to go around. We were fighting for each other, for the lives they had stolen, for the future they had tried to take from us. Every battle we won, every colony we liberated, brought us closer to reclaiming what was ours. And the assembly, for all its power, had no idea how to stop us. They had enslaved countless species before us, but none had fought back like this. None had turned oppression into strength the way humanity did. They had created their own nightmare, and now that nightmare was sweeping across the galaxy, leaving shattered fleets and burning worlds in its wake. We didn't just match their strength, we surpassed it. And as we rose, the assembly began to fall apart at the seams. Their allies grew hesitant, their soldiers grew afraid, and their leaders grew desperate. Humanity had become something they couldn't control, something they couldn't understand, and for the first time in their long, arrogant history, the assembly began to fear. The assembly was crumbling, and they knew it. For centuries, they had ruled with unchallenged authority, their vast network of species united under a banner of control disguised as cooperation. They had seen themselves as the architects of order in a chaotic galaxy, but now that order was disintegrating. Humanity, the species they had once dismissed as insignificant, had turned the tide of history. What had begun as scattered uprisings had become a revolution, and the assembly's once mighty fleets were in retreat. We didn't just fight battles. We waged a psychological war. Every victory we claimed was a message, not just to the assembly, but to the galaxy at large. We weren't just resisting, we were proving that the assembly wasn't invincible. The other enslaved species, those who had been crushed under the assembly's boot for generations, began to take notice. Some had given up long ago, resigned to their fates, but humanity's defiance reignited something in them: hope. On a distant agricultural world, a species known as the Shara, small, fragile beings who had been used as little more than living tools for farming, rose up for the first time in centuries. They had always been too weak, too afraid to resist, but when they heard of humanity's victories, they found their courage. Using rudimentary tools and sheer desperation, they overwhelmed their overseers and sent out a signal: "We fight because the humans fight." Similar uprisings began to spread across assembly-controlled worlds. The galaxy was waking up, and the Assembly's iron grip was slipping. But humanity didn't rely on hope alone. Our leaders, those who had emerged from the chaos of the camps and the fires of rebellion, understood the need for strategy. We couldn't win this war with passion alone. We needed to outthink and outmaneuver the Assembly at every turn. Commanders who had once been generals, tacticians, and freedom fighters coordinated our forces with a precision that the Assembly couldn't match. We struck their supply lines, ambushed their fleets, and dismantled their infrastructure piece by piece. Every strike was deliberate, calculated to weaken them where it hurt most. The Assembly tried to rally, throwing everything they had at us. They unleashed weapons of terrifying power, weapons that could turn entire planets into wastelands. But for all their firepower, they couldn't understand us. They couldn't comprehend the depth of humanity's will to fight. Where other species might have been cowed by such displays of strength, we only grew more determined. Every atrocity they committed, every planet they scorched, only hardened our resolve. They thought they could break us with fear, but fear had stopped working a long time ago. Their desperation became their undoing. In their haste to crush us, they overextended themselves, leaving key systems vulnerable. We exploited every weakness, targeting their command centers and severing their communication networks. Entire sectors fell into chaos as their fleets lost coordination, their soldiers left stranded without orders. The Assembly, once a symbol of unshakable power, was unraveling from within. I'll never forget the day we took our first Assembly capital. The planet, a gleaming metropolis of crystalline towers and sprawling cities, had once been a symbol of their dominance. When we arrived, they threw everything they had at us: warships, orbital defenses, ground forces. But it wasn't enough. Our ships tore through their fleets, our ground forces overwhelmed their defenses, and their proud capital fell to the very species they had sought to enslave. We didn't destroy the city. That wasn't our way. Instead, we broadcast our victory across the galaxy, showing every species what humanity was capable of. The sight of human banners flying over their capital sent shockwaves through the Assembly's ranks. Their soldiers began to desert. Their leaders fled to the farthest corners of the galaxy, and their remaining allies turned on them to save themselves. The galaxy wasn't just watching anymore. It was joining us. Species that had once bowed to the Assembly began to rise up, inspired by humanity's defiance. Former slaves became soldiers, and oppressed worlds became strongholds of resistance. We were no longer fighting alone. The war had become a movement, and that movement was unstoppable. The Assembly had made a fatal mistake. They thought they could enslave us, crush us, and erase us. But all they had done was awaken something they couldn't control. We weren't just fighting for freedom anymore. We were reshaping the galaxy. The Assembly fell faster than anyone could have predicted. What had once seemed like an eternal empire, an indomitable force that spanned star systems and united countless species under its rule, crumbled in mere years. Humanity, the species they had thought weak, primitive, and easily broken, had done the impossible. We had not only defeated our oppressors, we had dismantled the very foundations of their power, and now the galaxy stood at a crossroads with humanity at its center. When the last of the Assembly's ruling council surrendered, it was not with dignity or defiance, but with desperation. The once proud leaders, their arrogance finally shattered, begged for mercy. These were the same beings who had voted unanimously to enslave Earth, who had looked at our species and seen nothing but tools to be used and discarded. Now they groveled at our feet, their fleets destroyed, their worlds in ruins, their control reduced to ashes. But we were not like them. We could have destroyed them utterly, wiped their species from existence as they had so often done to those who resisted. Many among us wanted exactly that, a final, brutal reckoning for all the suffering they had caused. I could see it in the eyes of my comrades, the ones who had lost family, homes, and entire lives to the Assembly's greed. They wanted vengeance, and they would have been justified in taking it. Yet, humanity's strength had never been in our capacity for destruction. It was in our ability to endure, to rebuild, to create something better from the rubble. The Assembly had ruled through fear and domination, but we would not repeat their mistakes. Instead, we used their moment of weakness to reshape the galaxy. We established councils of liberated species, giving a voice to those who had been silenced for so long. We ensured that those who had suffered under the Assembly's tyranny had a hand in deciding what came next. It wasn't easy. The scars of the war ran deep, not just among humans, but across every species that had been oppressed. Trust was fragile, alliances were strained, and the desire for revenge lingered in the air like a storm waiting to break. But humanity had learned something during our years in the camps, something the Assembly had never understood. True strength comes from unity. We had survived because we had leaned on one another, shared our knowledge, and fought for a common purpose. Now we offered that same unity to the galaxy. Still, the Assembly's former allies weren't quick to trust us. They feared us now, just as much as they had once dismissed us. They had seen what we were capable of, how we had turned their advanced technology against them, how we had risen from nothing to overthrow the most powerful empire in the galaxy. They whispered about humanity's wrath, about the vengeance we could unleash if provoked. In their eyes, we were no longer victims. We were conquerors waiting for an excuse. But we had no interest in conquest. We had seen what power unchecked could do, how it could corrupt even the most advanced civilizations. Instead, we turned our focus inward, rebuilding Earth and helping other liberated worlds to heal. The camps, once symbols of oppression, were dismantled and replaced with centers of learning and diplomacy. The Assembly's war machines were repurposed, their weapons melted down and forged into tools for construction and exploration. Humanity had been forged in fire, and now we were determined to use that fire to illuminate the path forward, not burn it down. Of course, there were those who resisted the new order, remnants of the Assembly who clung to their old ways, pirates and warlords who sought to exploit the chaos, and even some of our own who believed we should seize the galaxy while it was vulnerable. But humanity had learned discipline through hardship. We were not the scattered, naive species the Assembly had first encountered. We dealt with threats swiftly and decisively, showing mercy where we could and strength where we must. The galaxy, for all its scars, began to change. Old divisions dissolved as species worked together for the first time in centuries. Former slaves became leaders, and former oppressors were held accountable for their crimes. The Assembly was gone, and in its place was something fragile yet full of potential. A galaxy where no species would ever again be enslaved or forgotten. And as humanity looked to the stars, we saw not a future of conquest, but of opportunity. We were no longer the species that had been dragged kicking and screaming into the galactic stage. We were something new, something stronger. The galaxy had underestimated us once, and they would never make that mistake again. For now, as we rebuilt what had been taken from us, we made a silent promise. We would never allow such tyranny to rise again. Not for us, not for anyone. Humanity had become the defenders of freedom, and we intended to keep it that way.